Okay, this is Tao, the Watercourse Way by Alan Watts with the collaboration of Chung-liang Huang. Okay, so, some books, they are just a waste of time and they have no answers. Some books do have some answers, and then there's sort of a third set of books that has some answers, but they actually lead to more questions. And I think this is one of those types of books that leads to more questions than answers. Um, so I just want to talk about some revelations that I've had or some things that I've noticed. So, have you ever noticed that what you want most in life seems to kind of elude you, but then you can easily get results in other domains of your life with basically where you don't really care and but you're not even trying. Have you ever noticed that? So I started noticing that often I go for one thing but get something totally different. So, as an example, I took this course by this entrepreneur guy, Sam Ovens, who's kind of well known. And I realized at the end of the course that I didn't really learn too much, but I ended up getting a really good friend out of it because he also did the course, and so we have a lot of the same like interests in business. Another one, which is also a course, was about making money. It was this group called M1, and their whole kind of thing was that you go in and you'd make your first million, but you wouldn't sacrifice your health. Like you wouldn't take some job where you'd have to work 80 hours a week, and you wouldn't sacrifice your family or your connections, right? And I went in there and I was not very healthy. I was smoking a lot of cigarettes at the time, drinking a lot. And I thought, the health would be a bonus, but really I'd get to my first million, and that's what I was really after. And when I left the group, I had not reached $1 million of net worth, but I had actually transformed probably the best thing I got from that was to quit smoking. And the guy who started it and ran it, Rock Thomas, huge shout out, Rock Thomas. He helped me to quit smoking, and I had one session with him, and I haven't smoked since, and that was like 10 years ago or something now. Um, but I also got a great friend out of it. Another course where I got a great friend, and that friend ended up becoming the best man at my wedding. So, it's like I went in for one thing, but I got something totally different. Um, so that's just one thing that I noticed. Another thing I noticed is a lot of entrepreneurs who seem to have success go through like a trial period before. And so here are just a few examples. So one was a guy in the Amazon online arbitrage space, and he was actually doing wholesale and had a ton of employees, and I think he was even doing like eight or nine figures, like some crazy number like that. And But then his son died, and like a young son, and he basically like shut down that business and went to online arbitrage, which is generally higher margin but like just a lot less moving parts. Like I think he has 5 or 6 VAs, and so it's like instead of having like 100 employees in a huge warehouse and a huge operation, he now has like 5 employees. And so I just saw him go through pain like that. Another person was in the cleaning space who actually started his business at the same time he started his business. I think it was some kind of stomach problem, and he was in the hospital, and so he was actually like calling people from the hospital, to start the business. Um, Another example is Elon Musk, and we've seen, he basically had one of his, I forget, it was basically one of the sons who became a daughter, or vice versa. I don't remember, but basically they were trans, and he thinks like he lost his child, to what he calls the woke mind virus, and that's really what persuaded him to buy Twitter. If you think about it, like it's kind of crazy. Bought a multi-billion-dollar company because of a child, right? His child. So, but all of those are people who went to suffer, and I guess we'll see with Twitter and X how that works out. But who basically went on to do good things, but after going through a period of suffering to get there. I've also noticed this in my own life. I think a lot of guys can relate to this. When you most want a girlfriend, they seem to elude you. They don't want anything to do with you. But then as soon as you're kind of comfortable with your situation being single, that's when they show up, right? And then if you start dating one, then uh, and you're really into her, then usually she'll dump you. But if you kind of don't care, then there'll be other girls who want you too. So it's more like the less you care, the better the results are. It almost seems like a cosmic joke of the universe that like the more you want something, the harder it is to obtain, but the less you want something, the easier it is to obtain. So there's this like attached indifference, kind of thing going on. Then another thing that got me on this path was the NVIDIA CEO, Jensen Huang, who gave this speech to Stanford. And basically in his speech, he said, he said, I wish you much suffering. Okay. And everyone was like, why? Like, what are you talking about? And he basically said, you've gone to Stanford. Presumably, you're going to have some way to pay for your education. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. Maybe that's in the future with a good job or whatever. And you've probably lived a pretty charmed life because you probably had like the best grades. You're the smartest person in your class. You did all these extracurriculars, and things have been really good for you. Otherwise, you wouldn't be at Stanford, right? And he said, but that means that you haven't gone through anything tough in your life. And being tough, like going through tough times, is what creates resilience. And you're going to need more and more resilience in the world. And so, I wish you much suffering, because the suffering is the only way you'll have to go through those hard times to build the resilience. And so I thought that was really interesting. It's like the way he thinks about the world is the more suffering I go through, the stronger I'll be, right? And so I should welcome that suffering. I shouldn't try to push it away. And so, yeah, and we also have phrases, right? Like no pain, no gain is another example of something like that. So anyway, on to the book, right? So first of all, Alan Watts, if you don't know who he is, he's kind of, I've always known him as like the Zen Buddhism, Western guy who translates Zen Buddhism to the West. He's an English guy. Now, I didn't know he covered Daoism at all, and kind of how I bumped into this book was really random. I'd been looking for a book that kind of translates a lot of the Taoist ideas to everyday life, and how do you apply this stuff? Because there's the Tao Te Ching, which is very terse and very dense, and it's sort of like, okay, I get the general kind of principles, but I don't know how to really apply that. And so, just a little background, like Alan Watts was kind of this kind of cult figure in the hippie movement in the 70s. In my neck of the woods, he spoke at Esalen a bunch. He actually lived in San Francisco. I think he lived in Marin. And so, but I've always kind of looked at him as almost this very undisciplined character. Like if you think about a lot of, Zen monks or whatever, it's like, they gain this sort of, they gain these results through practice, and through years of, asceticism. And this guy has always kind of seemed like a joker to me, like he hasn't done the hard work to obtain the goods, So anyway, I kind of went in with some reservation, but let's just go through the contents of the book, and then we can loop back, because the co-author actually talks about him after he dies, after he's died, and sort of some of the stuff about Alan Watts. So that was interesting to read. I'll circle back to that. But okay, so there's basically 4 main parts to this book. Chapter 2 through 5 are the 4 main parts. Okay, so I'm actually going to start with chapter 3, which is the Tao. So there's chapter 3, the Tao. Chapter 2 is yin-yang polarity. Chapter 4 is Wu Wei, which I have no experience with aside from art exhibit. And chapter 5 is virtuality, which we'll talk about in a second. So let's start actually with the Tao. So, what is the Tao? Okay, so the Tao is basically the process or course of nature. And he calls it the Watercourse Way because the flow of water is like the main analogy that's used in the Tao Te Ching and the various religious writings. So the Tao can be obtained but not seen. There is no way of putting a stream in a bucket of water, okay, or in a bucket, or the wind in a bag, okay. So one thing that gets talked about is this idea of Kropotkin's anarchism. So, and that basic idea was that even if you totally did away with the government and you just had complete anarchy, that people would naturally form a social hierarchy. Okay, so it's just in us to form this social hierarchy. And that's kind of one of the ideas here is that nature has what they call a mutual arising of both sort of positive and negative that come together um, that get generated together. This kind of goes to chapter 2, yin-yang polarity, which I'll talk about in a second, but that nature is essentially a harmonization of these things. And when each part is following its own nature, you get this harmony. But anytime you look at just one little piece of nature, that it looks like there's conflict. But if you can zoom out and see everything as a whole, it's actually all working together, sort of pushing in the same direction. But those pushes might look at odds, okay? And this is also gets into kind of governments and conquering nature, like in terms of like I was thinking a lot of Ayn Rand and sort of an Edward Rourke character who is trying to conquer nature, or a Benjamin Franklin, right, who's trying to understand this is all spiral dynamics orange, who's trying to understand like how nature works, but then really conquer it, right? I'm gonna not only harness nature but actually sort of subdue it to what I'm looking to get out of it, and that's creating a giant building, and kind of gets into some of this kind of Icarus, the myth of Icarus, right, who creates wax wings and flies too high, right, and falls because the wax wings burn up and he falls to the earth and dies, right? Or the Tower of Babel has kind of the same analogy there, right? As if you try to climb too high, you'll eventually kind of get pushed down. And so it's like if any person or any species tries to rule, he'll actually end up destroying the system. And if he really like someone who tries to conquer the world, right? They say not only does he put the system in danger, but he especially puts himself in danger. And this is really interesting right now, looking at Trump, who's obviously trying to in his words drain the swamp. But there have been several shootings at him, and so anyway, it's just kind of interesting to see that. Okay, so chapter 2. So I'm kind of going backwards in the book, is about yin-yang polarity, and I think we've all seen this, the yin-yang symbol. He didn't actually talk about how in the yin-yang symbol you have the little black dot inside the white half, and then the vice versa. He didn't really talk about how there's the seed of one in the opposite. But yeah, so one thing that's talked about here is how in Western societies we think of good versus evil. So in Christianity and Judaism and Islam, there's this idea of like, the good will go to heaven, right? Or in Judaism, there's the chosen people, right? And then the Ten Commandments and stuff like that, right? There's some code of conduct, and so it's like we're always trying to decrease evil and increase good, right? Both in our actions and like aspire to it. And so if you think about that, like that is really the idea of progress, right? But he would say that with yin yang polarity, with the to Chinese, that um, this idea is incomprehensible. That you could just increase good without also increasing bad, um, and that if you try to eliminate one, you basically eliminate the whole system. And so it's kind of like trying to say, okay, well, we're going to have more, positive magnetism without negative magnetism, right? It's just like it's incomprehensible. And so this also touches. So the Western society actually touches on the idea of progress, or is like thinks about life in terms of progress, where the Eastern society actually thinks in terms of cycles. And I was actually reminded of Neil Howe's book because he talks about how the modern person kind of thinks of progress, but the ancient person actually thinks of cycles because they're, farming and stuff like that. And so you're naturally thinking about, okay, well, it's the winter. The winter will come again, right? Now it's spring, now it's summer. So you get this kind of, we're going to live inside the cycles of nature versus like we're going to conquer nature, right? So that's kind of similar to the Tao kind of ideas. But yeah, so the Western society wants, it's kind of like this idea, it wants pleasure without the pain, right? That's what we're seeing right now with Ozempic, right? Any kind of miracle pill, right, is always this idea of like, oh, well, I can just have all the good parts without any of the bad parts. So health without sickness, wealth without poverty. That's another thing I'm noticing in entrepreneurship is that like the people who are actually entrepreneurs are okay suffering through like not having income for several years, which is kind of terrifying to me. But it's like, okay, if you can suffer through that, then you can actually get on the other side and make a lot of money. So, um, uh, this is a quote: "The art of life is more like navigation than warfare, going with the grain." Um, and then the two are not opposed but in love. Uh, and maybe I should just actually read this quote. So on page 26, the yin yang principle is not therefore what we would ordinarily call a dualism, but rather an explicit duality expressing an implicit unity. The two principles are, as I have suggested, not opposed like Zoroastrian, Ahura Mazda, but in love, and it is curious that their traditional emblem is that double helix, which is at once the pattern of sexual communion and of the spiral galaxies. One yin and one yang is called the Tao, the passionate union of yin and yang, and the copulation of husband and wife is the eternal pattern of the universe. If heaven and earth did not mingle, whence would everything receive life? The practicable problem of life was not to let their wrestling match get out of hand. Only recently have the Chinese set their hearts upon some kind of utopia. Yeah, so that's the idea of this, mutual arising again. Um, and then this idea of navigation versus warfare. The warfare is this conscious thinking or linear thinking versus a more going with the grain, which is intuitive, right? And so it's kind of saying like, well, you need both, right? So any sort of duality, if you look at like Hegel, there's this idea of the synthesis, right? The thesis and antithesis. The thesis comes about, and then you have the antithesis, which sort of fights it, and then there's a bigger whole that comes about, which is the synthesis. And I think there's something kind of, Taoist about that. But at the same time, the Taoist never sees it as contrary. So, yeah, all right. So anyway, on to chapter 4, Wu Wei. So Wu Wei is basically non-action. So it's action through non-action. But it's really about forcing. It's avoiding forcing something, right? So that's like going with the grain. We have these phrases like going with the grain or the path of least resistance. Now, what's really interesting is like we all want results in our life, right? And so often we try to force something to get that result. We try to impose some discipline. And if you think about it, one way you can think is like the West religions are trying to, um, you know, increase the good, decrease the evil, right? Something like Zen Buddhism, or Buddhism, right, is a practice that is trying to that is basically trying to cultivate some awareness of the universe, right? And it's not so much that there's good and bad, it's more that like you can't see your true nature. You can't see the true nature of the universe. So we need to do some practice, like sit there and meditate or yoga or whatever, to understand like the veil that's in front of our eyes, so that we really see the world as it is and we can avoid suffering, right? But he would say there, in that Taoism almost goes a step further, where it's like, yes, there is this truth about the world, but you can't actually cultivate a practice to get there. So now, what's interesting is they counter with this group called the Hessian Taoist, who actually did create practices, and it's almost like Buddhism, where they tried to do these like tantric things and yoga and whatever. But these authors, Alan Watts, claims that that Lao Tzu nor Chang Tzu knew nothing of the love of life or the hatred of death. Right, so it's almost this indifference. Now, one thing he does talk about is how Zen had this like direct pointing, and in a lot of Zen stories, you have that where the guy, he understands it, the student understands it, but then the master hits him with a stick, and then at the moment he gets hit with the stick, he's enlightened, right? So it's not something intellectual the master can teach him, even if he understands intellectually the concept. It has to be through some direct experience that the person in Zen becomes, the student in Zen becomes enlightened. So they do talk about this Wu Wei is like a dreamlike state. But they also talk about how if you go with it or you go against it, all of it is still Tao. So it's kind of funny, like even the trying to force something is part of nature, of Tao. It's almost like to really have surrender, you first need to go through this process of trying to tightly control something and understanding that it's not going to work. So this kind of leaves you with the question, okay, well, we still really want these results in our life, whatever those results are, being good at business, whatever, a better relationship, whatever it is. And so, if there's no practice to cultivate this, then what do you actually do, right? And so the answer actually is kind of interesting. Page 98, I'll go back and read it. One would like to leave it at that, except that such a statement evokes in many minds a tumult of questions. So this is all about, if you just go with the flow, right, you won't get your results. Instead of experiencing the now streaming, which would make everything clear, they want all kinds of preliminary guarantees that it will be safe and profitable to do so. As to whether this understanding works as a philosophy of life, of course it does, and very effectively, but if one follows it for that reason, one will not be following it. But if there is the understanding the power or virtue of Te arises spontaneously, or as Christians say, by divine grace, as distinct from willpower, in realizing that you are the Tao, you automatically manifest its magic. But magic, as a grace, is something to which no one should lay claim. When good things are accomplished, it does not claim or name them. So yeah, it's like this idea of almost faith or divine grace, that like everything will work out. And so I thought that was really, really fascinating, and tying it to Christianity, all right, so chapter 5, virtuality, which is a word I'd never heard or seen before, virtuality, but it's basically virtue. Okay, and they talk about this as something that goes unnoticed, but it's basically They say that it's more like the grace of God than human striving. The best conqueror does not uh, take place in war. Page 108, I'll just read that part. So, the best soldier is not soldierly. The best fighter is not ferocious. The best conqueror does not take place in war. The best employer of men keeps himself below them. Yeah, so this is like kind of illustrating a principle that I've long believed, that the person who's most boastful and most, sort of praising themselves and how good they are and how much money they've made is usually like almost more than likely the biggest fraud. And the person who, sort of quiet in the corner is like the person you actually should be listening to, right? Is the guy who's like developed deep expertise but isn't a great marketer. That's the person you want to listen to. So, all right. So he also contrasts Taoism versus Confucianism. And he basically says, the Confucianists really cared about politics, right? I mean, the art of war, as an example, right? Like politics and war. And they basically, that group sort of went into scholarship, right? Um, but the Taoist group sort of went more mystical and more empirical. So they started like observing nature versus trying to fight it, right? So the art of war, Confucianism, right, is fighting fighting reality. Um, but it was also interesting because it was about how this deep control or desire for control at least leads to like this stiffness that really hurts creativity. Um, so here's a quote from page 120. It's basically, the five colors blind one's eyes, the five tones deafen one's ears, the five tastes ruin one's palate. And that's from Lao Tzu. And then the commentary is, he is of course referring to the formal rules and classification for these arts, as to say that if you think there are only five colors, you must be blind, and deaf if you think that all music has to be in the pentatonic scale. So that's the, I guess, the pentatonic scale, I believe, is the normal major scale. I forget if that's with the seventh or flat or not. This is, alas, the reason why schools for these various arts produce so few geniuses, and why the genius, the person of today, is always going beyond the rules, not because of an obstreperous and antisocial spirit with hostile intent, but because the fountain of creative work is an intelligent questioning of the rules. The Taoists would be asking awkward questions concerning basic assumptions about the good life. Is it so good a thing to go on living for a long time? Would you rather go off with a prolonged whimper or with a glorious bang? Would you really like to hold a position of power, such as the presidency of the United States, or a great corporation, wherein you must make momentous decisions at almost every moment? At the root, then, is the idea of te as, and te is, by the way, virtue. This virtuality. Te is power exercised without the use of force and without undue interference with the order of surrounding circumstances. All right, so that's sort of the main thing. I think there's just one other part that's about Pangloss. So I haven't read Voltaire's Candide, but I believe that's how you say it. But apparently there's a character named Pangloss in it, and in the story, it's like they're out on a ship, him and it's like his friend or something, and basically the friend gets eaten by a shark, and Pangloss, he was mocking. Why can't I think of his Leibniz? So Leibniz had this whole thing about that we're living in the best of all possible worlds, and that was kind of his proof of God, or that God would only create the best of all possible worlds. And Voltaire is sort of mocking him about this, and so Pangloss is the character that's supposed to sort of be like Leibniz. But in the story, it's like Pangloss's friend gets eaten by a shark, and Pangloss basically says, "Oh yes, this is the best of all possible worlds. It was really good. He got eaten by a shark, right?" Almost this Pollyannish idea. And so, um, yeah, Alan Watts is here talking about this, about how, you might think that Taoism is sort of like this sort of Pollyannish, everything, nothing could possibly go wrong. But I'll just read this. So, uh, in a material and practical sense, Taoists succeed, but their success depends on a confidence and lack of self-frustrating anxiety, which in turn is derived from the insight that in the course of nature and following the line of least resistance, nothing can go wrong. I do not think this is the superficial attitude of Pangloss, of the hardy and thoughtless view that this is the best of all possible worlds. And then further, the superficiality of Voltaire's Pangloss is that he is all talk and will not willingly and shamelessly scream uh, when eaten by a shark. Certainly he will scream, but he will feel that in doing so he has betrayed his philosophy, not realizing that screaming and squirming are the natural way of going along with pain. Taoism is not a philosophy of compelling oneself to be calm and dignified under all circumstances. So, by the way, very very different from Stoicism, right? Which is we're gonna rehearse our future pain so that when it comes, we will be, we'll be dignified, right? We won't be so upset about it. The real and astonishing calm of people like Lao Tzu comes from the fact that they are ready and willing, without shame, to do whatever comes naturally in all circumstances. The unbelievable result is they are far more sociable and civilized than those who try to live rigorously by laws and watchwords. Okay, so I just wanted to finish by talking about some of the stuff written by the co-author, and they talked about, and he basically did a lot of the calligraphy, and the calligraphy, it's called the Watercourse Way, but one of the things is the calligraphy itself. It's almost a more direct sense of experience than a typical English written word. And you can see this in like airports and stuff, and they talk about that. But the actual act of writing these letters, you need you need to kind of go with the flow when you're actually writing these in Chinese calligraphy or Japanese calligraphy. Like, if there's any kind of hesitation, you mess it up. So you kind of need to know what's right. But it was sort of interesting hearing the Chung-liang Huang, his reflections on both in the forward and the conclusion on Alan Watts. And so Alan Watts was an Englishman, and he was brought up very conservative. He was a very good student, kind of did what his mother told him, kind of thing. And as he got more popular, he actually started developing a drinking problem, and he was an alcoholic. And so one of the things that gets talked about is, for instance, in the forward, his foremost concern was enjoyment for himself and his audience. But in the conclusion, it talks about how he, kind of went from one extreme to the next, and he went from this very conservative, good boy, English good boy, uptight kind of person to this kind of wild alcoholic guy with no inhibitions. And I don't know what to make of that. That probably says more about Alan Watts than Daoism. But anyway, yeah. So, like I said at the start, this is one of those books that it gives you more, produces more questions than it really has answers. I think that if you look at Buddhism, like there's various types of Buddhism, but at the essence, they're all about seeing reality, as it really is, and the human condition as it really is. It occurs to me that Taoism is even more sort of removed or even more bare, where it's not trying to prescribe anything, it's not trying to tell you to do anything. It really is just an observation of the way humans operate and the way nature operates, and humans as a part of nature. So Anyway, just food for thought. I really enjoyed this book. I'd love to read more books on Taoism. I'd love to use the principles more, or maybe not use it. Maybe that's a better way of going with the flow. And because I've seen that it works in almost all domains where you kind of go with the flow versus trying to fight things. For instance, in sales is something I've noticed. Like, you can never really convince someone of something. They have to convince themselves, and you try to just go with whatever they're thinking. In a lot of ways. So anyway, Tao, the Watercourse Way by Alan Watts.